Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Ewalt. I serve the Texas Tribune as Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us in person here in Austin and those joining us online for our We the Texans conversation focused on public access to government. Last year, Texas's open records law turned 50 years old. The Texas Public Information Act was meant to usher in a new level of government transparency and followed a stock fraud scandal that reached the top levels of state government. First Amendment advocates say that while government agencies work hard to satisfy open records, others often flout the law, leaving the public in the dark on information they should rightly have about how local and state government or state agencies are operating. In this conversation, part of the Texas Tribune's We the Texans project, looking at the state of democracy in Texas, we'll talk about the challenges with the implementation of the Texas Public Information Act, how it's affecting Texans, and what solutions are available. We're joined today by Rachel Clow, specialty producer at KRIS 6 News, Kelly Shannon, executive director of the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, Ruth Soucy, Deputy General Counsel for Open Records Section at the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, and media lawyer Laura Prather, partner at Haynes Boone. Our moderator is Texas Tribune Managing Editor for News and Politics, Matthew Watkins. Our program will run an hour with 45 minutes for conversation and 15 minutes for your questions. Here in Austin, we have a mic at our mic stand for our in-person audience, and our virtual audience can also submit questions online at our Q&A portal, texastribune.org/ask. We're grateful for the support of our sponsors. Our major sponsor is Methodist Healthcare Ministries, and our foundation sponsor is the Henry Luce Foundation. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. I also want to thank all of those around the state who make the journalism of the Tribune, including our events, possible by becoming a Texas Tribune member. To learn more and to become a member, visit texastribune.org/support. And I want to call attention to our upcoming event, Inside the Interim, a conversation with Dallas lawmakers on Thursday, July 11th at Dallas College's Mountain View campus. Whether it's education, the state budget, or housing affordability, Texas's state lawmakers will have their hands full when they convene next year for the legislative session. We'll hear from lawmakers about their priorities for the session and what it all means for Dallas residents. And stay tuned for news on similar events around the state. You can learn more about this and upcoming events at texastribune.org/events. And last bit of news here, tickets are now on sale for Texas's breakout politics and policy event, the Texas Tribune Festival, which returns to downtown Austin from September 5th through 7th. Join us for 3 days of conversations about the issues that matter to Texans at our annual celebration of big, bold ideas. Purchase your tickets at tribfest.org. Now let's get to know our panel. Rachel Clow, an award-winning specialty producer, began her career in newspapers before transitioning to a specialty producer role in television with a focus on investigative journalism. Last year, she was part of the team that exposed deadly problems with wrong-way drivers on the Harbor Bridge in Corpus Christi. That reporting led to significant traffic changes that officials said have saved lives. For this reporting, KRIS 6 News was the recipient of the Carol Nealand Award, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this work and some of Rachel's other investigative work during today's conversation. Kelly Shannon has served as executive director of the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas since 2013. She oversees FOI advocacy, educational seminars and conferences, and other outreach. She has been a journalist for 3 decades. She was a correspondent for the Associated Press, first in San Antonio, and later as bureau leader in Austin, where she covered government and politics. Ruth Soucy has worked in the area of open government for more than 30 years. Since 1999, she has served as Deputy General Counsel for Open Records at the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. And in this capacity, she manages the Open Records section, including legal staff, data analysis, staff, and accounts examiners. She was an Assistant Attorney General for 6 years in the Open Records Division of the Attorney General's Office. And Laura Prather represents a broad array of clients at the trial and appellate court level in First Amendment and anti-SLAPP, that's strategic lawsuit against public participation, and intellectual property disputes. She represents content providers, including online and traditional publications, cable and terrestrial broadcasters, streaming media platforms, podcast production companies, and music and sports entities. She was awarded the American Lawyer's inaugural Tony Morrow Media Lawyer Award for her efforts advocating for legislation to strengthen First Amendment rights, including zealous advocacy for free speech rights, both at the State House and the courthouse. And our moderator, Matthew Watkins, managing editor for news and politics for the Texas Tribune, oversees the day-to-day planning for news coverage. He began working at the Tribune in 2015 and was previously a reporter, breaking news editor, and politics editor. I thank our panel and our audience for being here in Austin and around the state this morning. And with that, I turn the program over to Matthew.
All right, thanks, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And thanks to all of you out here for being here. And hello to all the people watching on the live stream as well. I want to talk, Matt mentioned at the beginning, we're coming off the 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act, a major change in how open state government and really government in Texas is in the state. It's been, I guess now maybe 51 years. We're into the second half century of this law. And Kelly, you have well, really everyone on this stage has to some degree, spent a good part of their careers devoted to kind of fighting for open government. So we're somewhat partisans, on this particular issue of the belief that, the public has the right to understand what's being done in their name and on their behalf. But I think in order to understand the impact of this law, it's useful to understand the context in which it was passed. It was passed during a time of scandal or during a time of kind of reaction to scandal. Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about that period, what led to this, and what the atmosphere was when they decided to pass this law?
Yeah, so as was mentioned, it was started as the Texas Open Records Act, enacted in 1973. This followed on the heels of the breaking of the Sharpstown scandal. Many of you may know about it, many of you may not. Good thing to look up if you don't. But this was a scandal that engulfed state politics, and it really created this atmosphere where members of the public wanted to know more about what was going on with their government. They wanted to be able to follow the money. They wanted to know how our public officials are making the decisions they are, who's pulling the strings, et cetera. So this created the atmosphere in which the Texas Open Records Act could be enacted. And it was written as and intended as one of the strongest of these such laws in the country. And that's something for us all to be very, very proud of. And it's still around, as we've mentioned, 50 years later. So it's written to give the individual information requester the real power in the whole dynamic, not the government, but the individual who is requesting the information. And we can talk more later about the structure of it and how the law is used, but that's a real important thing. And that structure is still there today. So through the years, the law has remained in that, the same process has remained. However, through the years, the law has been chipped away at. More and more exceptions have been added to the law to where information is blocked from release. We're always fighting to make sure that doesn't happen, but it has happened, and the law's gotten a little watered down through the years. So we're always, just in a nutshell, we're being very diligent at all times to try to keep the law strong, keep it up with, on two fronts, technology, which we can talk about in a bit, because obviously the way we store information, disseminate information has changed through the years. So we want to keep the law with modern times. And then very, very importantly, we want to stay up with and ahead of those who seek to undermine the law. And by that, I mean some governments, not all governments, but some governments look for loopholes, they look for ways around the law, they look for ways to delay. So we need to keep up with that and have some strong enforcement mechanisms in the law. And we're always working to improve that, to make some fair but strong enforcement mechanisms. So 50 years on, The law keeps on ticking. It's a great thing that we have it. We just have to work really hard to keep it as it was intended.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit later about the ways that maybe it has, enforcement has changed or it has lost some of its strength. But first, just sort of set the baseline. Well, Laura, actually, I'm going to go to you and tell us a little bit about just what it means in practicality. Like, what does this law give me as a citizen the ability to do?
Well, it gives you the ability to be able to know what your government is doing. And so if you submit a Public Information Act request, the burden is then on the government to say why you shouldn't get these materials. The assumption is these are public records. And those public records are so that you can have a check and balance on what your government is doing, because you're the one that has put them in power. And they shouldn't be able to determine what you do and don't see. So the onus is on them to assert that an exemption, which is to be interpreted narrowly, applies to the materials if they don't want to give you those documents. And there's a process that you can go through where the government may ask the Attorney General to issue an opinion as to whether or not they give you those documents. And then if the Attorney General says they don't have to give you the documents, then you may have to go to court to try to get them. But hugely important is the fact that the assumption is the records are open. And the reason that they are open is so that you can be informed about what your government is doing.
And so, of course, one of the biggest users of these Open Records Act is our journalists, right? This is the law that launched 1,000 investigative stories across the state. And it feels like every community has at least one journalist who, has built a reputation as someone who breaks stories, brings about impact and everything like that. If you're a government official and a open records request lands in your inbox from this person, you might think, uh-oh, what's happening here? And, Rachel, I would say is, if you're not familiar with Corpus Christi News, is definitely one of those reporters. A frequent user of open records requests, a frequent generator of results with her journalism, and a good example of kind of the power of this law and the change that it can bring. I want you to tell us a little bit about how you've used these requests in the past. Maybe we can start with some of your reporting on the Nueces County District Attorney's Office about dismissals that were being done in that case. Tell us a little bit about how you heard about this story, what the story ended up being, and how you used open records to kind of get to the heart of that story.
Well, first, I think public information is just one tool in our toolbox as a journalist, right? And very often it starts with a tip where somebody says, hey, there are a lot of dismissals happening in the district attorney's office, and we don't know why. And so that's a perfect public information request. What we learned with the Nueces County District Attorney's Office through public information requests, and by the way, they were incredibly responsive. They gave us our documents within 2 days, and they didn't try to hide anything. But what we learned is that they were dismissing cases en masse in order to meet actually not just state requirements, but federal requirements with the criminal justice information system. So you have to clear a certain number of your cases every year. And if you don't do it, the office of the governor says you don't get grant money. And so having the ability to see those records and really begin to dig into what was happening in the district attorney's office then was kind of a domino effect of, we now discovered this issue and this issue and this issue. Ultimately, that reporting was cited in a petition to remove the district attorney from office, in a lawsuit to remove him from office.
Yeah, in your story, I think the first one, if I read them in the correct order, led with the person who had been accused of murder, right? Who had, I think it was at a gas station or something, right. They had surrounded, someone was shot and killed. The person arrested in this crime was arrested and charged and indicted for murder. they then dismissed that case, ended up going after them only on a possession of a firearm by a felon charge, right?
Correct.
For a much less significant sentence. And there were cases like this, maybe not to that extreme in every case, but cases like this where cases were being dismissed without, the full, go ahead.
Right. Well, and what we eventually learned is that through public information requests, we learned that there were multiple instances of people who had been placed on deferred probation. So instead of going to prison, you're going to have your sentence deferred. But if you mess up, we can send you to prison. So what the district attorney's office was doing to meet these numbers is new allegations would come forward and they would say, nope, we're going to abandon those charges. We had 2 women killed by a man who they decided to abandon charges, who was on probation. And he's admitted guilt to those murders. Where is the justice in that, right? 2 women now dead in order to meet grant requirements. It's frustrating for the public.
So tell us a little bit about, you get this tip that this is happening. What are you asking for? What are you getting from the government using these kind of open record laws?
Well, that's a tricky thing. I mean, with the district attorney's office, it was initially when I started putting in requests, it was hard because nobody knew who was in charge of complying with the law, right? And so now there's a dedicated person who responds to these. You have to not be super broad. So using terms like CJIS, which is Criminal Justice Information System, it's sometimes finding a needle in the haystack, and then you have to pinpoint a little bit more, and I don't think I answered your question.
But you know what? I just to interject there, I think Rachel makes a great point, is the more precise you can be with making an information request, and we should preface all this by saying the Public Information Act kicks in when a request is made in writing. So if you go in and verbally ask for it, that doesn't kick in the Texas Public Information Act and all of its protections. And I always advise people, be very precise, because 1, that's going to get you exactly what you're looking for. It's also going to save time for the government, same time for you. So I think that's a really good point. Just think hard about what it is you're looking for and keep it very narrowly focused. You can always go back and make another request later, but keep focused.
And I think, Kelly, one of the things that you're bringing to light is the fact that this is a law that's for everyone. It's a law that's for all Texas citizens. And so, yes, the media uses it quite a bit because the media is serving as a conduit for the people and bringing to light issues for the people. But this is a law that is for every single person in this room, online, throughout the state of Texas, so that you can do things as simple as finding out how your taxpayer dollars are being spent. And that's just hugely important to keep in mind.
Ruth, your department handles these requests for the Comptroller's office.
Yes, we do.
As I was preparing for this panel, I started to feel guilty because I realized that I've interacted with dozens, if not hundreds, of departments that handle open records requests and never asked about the experience for y'all. So tell us a little bit about how, from the government agency's perspective, this process works.
Well, from our perspective, really, we love our media requesters, but y'all are the very tiniest group of requesters. Most of our requesters are members of the public. Some of them are people that we would normally interact with, such as taxpayers. They may be consultants. They can be lobbyists. They can be lots of folks. And then there's the guy who read a story, and he just wants to know if there's some information he should get because he's interested. And so you're dealing with very unsophisticated requesters, very sophisticated requesters. So that we have an interactive process. You say, I want X, right? And we have an online portal. If you send it in through there, you can certainly send it in by mail. We get them that way. We get people walking in. We get faxes still. We get emails. But we do have an online portal. So I can say, okay, well, you're asking for this. Can you narrow it down? Here's some possibilities. And we try to interact to get down to what you want. And then, of course, there are folks who just think we're friendly. And so they'll go, I'm trying to find my criminal history. Can you help me? And it's like, well, the comptroller doesn't have that, but here's a website, and this may be the agency you might want to check with. So that's our experience is there's a lot of customer service involved, frankly.
Do you know how many, ballpark, how many requests the comptroller gets?
Well, through our portal, maybe 20,000 in a year, but you know, what will count as a request per the AG, because they say if someone asks for something and you have to respond, folks may be coming in through our unclaimed property system. So they're making requests in writing for something. So technically, there's a lot, but what I'm actually interacting with is probably about 20,000 a year.
And how big is the staff that's dealing with that?
Well, we do more than just respond to requests. So I have a couple of data analysts, and they spend a great deal of time putting information out. We have a transparency department, and we collaborate with them. A law was passed some years back that we wanted higher interest, higher value public data sets put online, and so DIR created an open data portal. So they're busy pushing together data sets to get it published and out there. Many agencies like ours decided to put more stuff on our own site. So for example, you can go into our site and you can find, you know, how much was paid to a particular vendor in a particular year. So my folks are answering some things like that. We have an interagency agreement with the IRS where they ask for information, we may ask for stuff. We kind of administer that. So we do a number of things. I think, you know, maybe 15 people, but a couple of lawyers, couple of, we have accounts examiners who understand tax records because we had a lot of tax record requests, and some legal professionals and our data analyst. So I do kind of a mixed group of people, which I like. Some places, their open government department gets requests in, and then they send it to folks to respond to. But if they think it's problematic or there's a concern, they send it to the lawyers. So lawyers get this tiny little glimpse of, well, I'm looking at this and I'm going to send it to the AG. In my case, I get to see all of it, and it's kind of fun.
Very good. So Texas, for a long time over the life of this law, has had a reputation as being a strong open government state. Why is that? What was it about Texas and Texas's law over that time? And we can talk about whether that's still the case. But what was it that set Texas's law apart from, you know, many other states?
For me. Okay, so as we mentioned earlier, the law is designed in a way, and as Laura mentioned, that all records are presumed open. So that's a big thing right there. And then if there are exceptions to releasing documents, government records, then, you know, that's where it comes into play of, you know, a government has to seek permission to do it. In almost all cases, there are some cases like W-2 information or certain personal emails and things that they can just withhold. But in almost all cases, for a government to be able to say, no, I don't want to release this information to you because I believe it falls under one of the exceptions, the government, local government, state agency, what have you, has to go to the Attorney General's office and ask permission to do so. Some states, no. Some states, I deal with counterparts around the country where they have agencies that just go, no, you're not getting that information. And then it's up to the individual requester to start fighting the fight and making the appeals and asking permissions and things. In our state, it's tilted to where the individual has the power and the government has to argue why they should withhold. So it's that dynamic right there is very, very important. And so the way it's structured in our state is the Attorney General's office makes these rulings on, yeah, you can withhold this, no, you cannot, you must release it. So they're acting like an umpire, kind of calling the balls and strikes, and it's a third party. So it's not just that government that you're dealing with making the decision on their own. So does that make sense? Okay, so that's one way that we are considered one of the strongest in the country. And I'd say that's the biggest reason as far as going back to how it was written. Now, as you say, we can always talk about where are we now and what needs to happen.
Well, Laura, let's talk about that. Is Texas losing its position as a strong open government state?
We are now Swiss cheese. We have so many holes in our Texas Public Information Act, so many exceptions, not just in the TPIA, but in other laws that are directly related to the TPIA. It is now just landmines of exemptions that apply. And the knee-jerk reaction in far too many cases is for the governmental entity to request an AG opinion, which then slows down the process of being able to get the records, even when there is no basis for doing so. So, for instance, a couple of sessions ago, there was a law that was passed to make certain contract information super public, things like the amount of the contract, any sort of governmental perks that were being offered with the contract, things along those lines. And what we're seeing happening is instead of that clearly delineated super public information being disclosed when it is requested, oftentimes the entities are asking the Attorney General, well, what can I withhold? And submitting the entire contract for review instead of doing what the law requires, which is give us the super public information in the first instance, then go fight about whatever you think might be the secret sauce in the contract at the AG later. And it's just a way of delaying the process. Now, not everyone's doing this, and Ruth's organization, the Comptroller's Office, is absolutely phenomenal in that they have a Texas Transparency Star program where they encourage governmental entities to put their contracts online so that it saves everybody time. You don't have to submit a Public Information Act request to get it. There it is. It's online. They can just refer you to it. And they give awards for those governmental entities that participate in this program. And Ruth can probably talk about that a little more, and the fact that they have an online portal, which is also not something that everybody has, that makes it very user-friendly to be able to get this information.
Well, all I wanted to mention is there's a really good reason for why you don't want to do too many referrals to the AG. First off, you do want to be transparent. That's the role of government. You're representing people. You're trying to do good customer service. But also, it is time consuming, okay? Every time you do a referral to the Attorney General's office, it takes hours of my time to have to sort through this, figure it out, make an argument, go back and forth. And what you're supposed to be doing is separating out what's public, giving that out, only narrowing it down to, okay, there's this one document we're concerned about. We've told the requester we think this is protected. They still want it. They definitely want a ruling, so here's a ruling. So you want to narrow it down. And, I always tell people, let's reduce the referrals to the AG. It's going to save me time, make my life easier, make everyone's life easier. And that's really the point, is let's get as much stuff out as we can. If we're down to something we have to protect, let's send it over. And as a consequence, we generally win on our rulings because we're not sending a ton of stuff. And I think that's should be the role, because every time I look at those numbers of referrals to the Attorney General, it grows every single year. It's amazing.
The workload is enormous. And then you think about also the fact that oftentimes it is taxpayer dollars that are being spent for the attorneys to draft the letters to block the information from becoming public. So your money's being spent to block you getting information.
If it's protected, you should protect it. But if it's not, it should be released, because then you're wasting money and time, and you're right, taxpayer dollars on attorneys' time.
But what you're describing is, again, I'm going to go back to that customer service phrase you keep using. If I'm dealing with a governmental body who contacts me and says, hey, I need this clarified, and I believe this might be exempted, and this is the reason why it's exempted, and I have a measure of trust with that governmental body because they've been transparent and they've complied every single time, I'm probably going to say, you know what? Give me the public information. I'm okay with you not sending out for an AG ruling.
And that's
right.
There is trust. There is, and I've had requesters that start with, I don't really think that this is going to be attorney-client. When I'm going, okay, I can give you this. I'm not going to give you this. It's internal attorney-client. I think that's protected. And I go to the attorney general. And with one frequent requester, I think I went 5 times, and each time I got a positive ruling. And the next time I said, well, I think I can give you this, but this is attorney-client. He's like, don't bother going to the attorney general this time. I'm willing to trust you, Ruth. So that helps.
Well, and let me say, what Ruth is talking about here, the customer service and the communication with requester is so important. And there are governments out there who just will not communicate with requesters. In fact, some of them even ignore requesters. But if you have that give and take, that meet and confer, that, whatever you want to call it, you can discuss things and reach common ground a lot of times, and then it doesn't have to result in this formal, ongoing, lengthy process to send something
I
to the
agree.
Attorney General.
I absolutely agree.
You told me on the phone last week the number of referrals that go to the Attorney General's office. Can you remind me of that number?
Yeah, so I think their latest count is around 44,000 rulings they did last year. So those are letter rulings where they rule on each and every.
Right, but let me ask how many of those actually should have gone to the AG
Right.
that were not just, we're going to obstruct, and by the way,
Yeah.
we're going to kill your news story because we're going to send this to the AG.
Great point.
So
Yeah.
let's take a step back here and talk about this, right? Because
Yeah.
the process here is you submit your request. The law says that you have 2 weeks or 10 business days to respond, right? But if you believe that something may be withheld, you can send it to the Attorney General's office. That is then supposed to be sort of the neutral arbitrator to rule. Of course, you can also send it to the Attorney General's office if you maybe just want to slow the process down. Because
No,
when,
you should not do that.
Well,
See,
But it
here's the thing.
happens.
Okay, I'm going to pull back on some ethical standards here. You're not supposed to intentionally impede the process.
Right.
You're supposed to be dealing in good faith. You have an obligation as a public servant, and also if you're an attorney, to deal in good faith. Now, if there is
We like
there is a question about, okay, I'm just not real sure, of course send it. Maybe you'll lose, maybe you'll win, but you'll get clarity for the future. So the next time you can say, well, they thought this was protected, or no, they didn't. That's good faith. But saying, yeah, I just want to slow this news story down, that's not good faith.
that is absolutely true. I'm curious, Rachel, whether in your experience, most people, or maybe not most, but whether all agencies have the same sort of approach as Ruth's does.
There are certainly some really great governmental bodies within, and my coverage area is not just Nueces County, but a 13-county region, so it's exhausting. But then there are others, like, for instance, TxDOT. TxDOT, we worked on the project about wrong-way drivers on the Harbor Bridge. And we wanted to know, what did TxDOT know, when did they know it, and what action did they take? Turns out they knew 10 years ago and they didn't take any action. But when we put in that request, they immediately said, we're going to send this to the AG. So then I wrote a response to the AG, sent my response to TxDOT, and they said, oh, just kidding, we're going to give you a bunch of information, thinking that, they really want to kick the can down the road and think that you're going to go away.
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience, right, is we know whether it is being sent rightfully or wrongfully, which will be determined through the process, is we know that when you get that letter saying we're sending it to the AG, often on the 10th day, your calendar now for getting that information from the government goes from days to months. And that can be helpful to an agency that maybe wants controversy around a certain issue to die down, or, busy journalists to lose interest. I mean, I can say from my experience, back when I was a reporter, you submit a request, you get the AG's thing, and then, months later you get the letter back from the AG's office, and you're like, wait, which request was this? Or people have moved on and all things, and that can definitely be a frustrating experience.
But that, I think, is also the responsibility of the journalist for governmental bodies that are doing this. When you do get the ruling from the AG, you have to report that. You have to say, we asked for this 4 months ago, 3 months ago, and we just received it. We have a responsibility to say we are going to continue to report even if you delay.
One of the issues here is, again, you're talking about 40,000 requests going to the AG. There's also, it's a sort of an enforcement issue, right? When there's so many requests, a rather small group of people fielding those requests, it feels like there can sometimes be a little bit like ignoring the spirit of the law can be sort of treated like, driving 62 miles per hour in a 60 mile per hour zone. It's technically illegal, but your chances of getting pulled over and getting a ticket are pretty slim. I'm curious, I'll start with you, Kelly, but if you could sort of have the magic wand to say, you have one thing you can do that could fix this, could make this process better, what would you use it on?
Can I have two? Okay.
You can only if one of the
I'm
other
having
people on the
trouble
panel will let you
deciding.
borrow it.
I've got two right in my head. I'm hoping I'm not forgetting them. I'll let Laura attack the second one. The first one I'm talking about, this ties right into what Ruth was saying, is good faith governments versus bad faith actors, right? And if there's a way, if there would be a way, and we're always working on this, how do you dissuade some of these bad faith acting governments from abusing the Attorney General's ruling system? Because that's what's happening. That's why they get flooded with so many of these requests, right? So if there's a way of a penalty or an encouragement to make sure that these governments are not just, I'll just punt it up to the AG's office. I don't want to sit here and have to sift through and figure out what's public, what's not. That's what we're always working on. But a second thing, and Laura can address this better than I can, but there are some provisions you can take in with legal system if somebody does have to go to court and be able to recoup attorney's fees if they win it, right? That's an enforcement mechanism too that could be considered. But Laura knows a little more than I do about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up on this. So the good customer service. I mean, let's think about this. We have this in other laws. We have this in our DTPA law, a notice and an opportunity to cure. Give people the opportunity to make it right. So here, if you just put in a meet and confer requirement, before you kick something up to the AG's office and you simply say, have a conversation or attempt to have a conversation about this so that you can narrow the request or clarify the request or do whatever to be able to lighten everybody's workload and get some clarity as to what's actually being asked for, that doesn't seem like a heavy lift, but believe it or not, we have had that resisted at the legislature, having a requirement like that, and that seems like that is Ms. Manners 101. It shouldn't be hard to do. The second is attorney's fees. And the way the court system works right now, we do have a provision in the law that talks about the ability to get attorney's fees if you have to take an action where you're seeking public information through the court system. The problem is the way that law has been interpreted is the governmental entity can hand you the records after you've gone through the process of filing a court action, filing a summary judgment proceeding, getting a ruling from the court that you are correct, your summary judgment should be granted. Government hands you the documents because the court has just ordered them to, and then they can allege that everything is moot and you do not get your attorney's fees. Now, our law in Texas used to mirror the federal law. The federal government changed the law. FOIA changed more than a decade ago to fix this problem. We tried to fix this problem, and we tried to mirror FOIA so that requesters could be able to actually get their attorney's fees back if they've had to go through this cumbersome, very expensive process. The bill made it all the way through the legislature and was vetoed by the governor. The problem with that is there is absolutely no incentive for a governmental entity to give you the documents if they can force you to pay tens of thousands of dollars to go through the court system and then hand them to you months, years later, and there's no repercussions.
But let's also be real and think about how many people have tens of thousands of dollars to even file a court action, right? As working for local media, we don't have that kind of money. We rely on help from attorneys who do it pro bono, but what about the public?
That's a huge problem.
Does anybody else want to use their magic wand? All right, good.
I would love a magic wand that actually maybe makes district attorneys enforce violations of the Public Information Act. Our newly appointed DA in Nueces County has said, well, we're not an investigatory agency, so if you have a complaint, it needs to go to the Corpus Christi Police Department because they don't have an understanding of what their role is and what the law is. So it's a misdemeanor, but nobody enforces it.
I've got one other thing to add. I do wish that we had more teeth in the law to create an actual stronger. We kind of have an informal complaint process with the Attorney General's office, but it's informal is the key word there. And even if somebody does file a complaint with the Attorney General's office, they're very quick to tell you, well, we don't have an investigative arm that can go out there and look into what the government is telling us and arguing to us. So a lot of times they just have to take the word for it from the government. One example I'll bring of this very quickly is, and this is not regarding police records in Uvalde, but this has to do with the Uvalde Leader newspaper trying to get at what kind of severance payments were made to school district employees after the horrible mass shooting in Uvalde. And there are records. If they paid people to terminate them and send them on their way, there's a record of that payment. But the Uvalde newspaper ran into many roadblocks in trying to get this information. They did end up filing a complaint with the Attorney General's office. The school district said, we gave them every record we have. We don't have any more records. And so because there's not that investigative ability, okay, case was closed, and then records were not turned over.
Okay, so I'm going to ask an unpopular question, which is this law is now over 50 years old. The way people work, the way people communicate is very different now than it was in 1973. A lot more talking on the phone back then. When you were putting something in writing, it was maybe in a memo that was expected to be a little bit more permanent. Now we have, in office instant messaging, text messages, all kinds of things that are maybe a little bit less, formal in that way. All of those things are, by the letter of the law, public records that the, by the law, the public has a right to. But is that maybe why we see some of this pushback and some of this noncompliance? I mean, is it actually helpful to hear to be able to see all the stray thoughts of internal deliberations and conversations?
Oh, I'm going to push back on that because, I have a story set to air tonight, hopefully, fingers crossed, where our city manager has been putting things in text on his personal phone that very directly relate to city business, and every citizen has a right to see. Now, did he turn those records over? Absolutely not. Did I already have those records? Yeah, I did. And then when pushed back, he said, oh, well, I was busy. I wasn't not going to comply. I was just busy, a month and a half after. So yes, people have a right to see it. They don't have a right to see everything.
One of the issues, and I will actually say this is something we do. If you're a new employee, part of your new employee orientation concerns an introduction to open records, what we require, and also records management. Here's how you keep your records. Personal devices, no, you're not. You're supposed to be keeping government records on government systems. Every 2 years, you have to get mandatory training, again, on open records and on records management, because you need to understand if you're keeping government records on a personal device, those are government records. You have to turn them over. They have to be maintained. This should not be happening. But if it is, then it needs to be treated as such. And the first thing I really think in ensuring that people comply with the law is to educate them about the requirements of the law. There may be people who willingly wish to circumvent the law. But I think for 99% of the people, they just don't really understand it. And so you have to start with education.
Okay, we are right at around 9:45, so if anyone has any questions, I will invite you to come up to the microphone and ask. It looks like we're getting a pretty good line here, so I will go ahead and kick it off to questions.
Just a reminder for those watching online that you can ask questions at texastribune.org/ask. And I also just remind everyone in the audience, especially since we already have a line here, to try to keep your questions concise and make sure that they have a question mark at the end. Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm John Woodley. I'm with Advocates for Disability Access. And are you aware of any barriers for accessibility of obtaining government documents? Sometimes they're in a photograph form, but they may not be readable for someone who with vision impairment, or videos of meetings that are not transcribed.
It's an excellent question. Does anyone know how?
Well, if there is a disability issue in accessing government records, we will say, if you have, concerns or there is a need for another format, talk to us. We'll get it to you in another format. That's the role of government, is to serve all people, including those who may need something in a different format.
And I'll add, we haven't talked much today about the Texas Open Meetings Act, and that's a more straightforward law, pretty self-explanatory. Public Information Act is more complicated, but I do know there have been rulings where certain governments try to have their meetings in an unusual place, not in their usual meeting place, but there's been rulings that always it has to be accessible to people with disabilities. That's one of the things. There are times where they can hold it in spots where you have to show a photo ID, and that's been allowed, surprisingly, right? But it seems to me like that shouldn't even have to happen. But they have always consistently ruled open meetings need to be ADA accessible.
Thank you for your question.
When a nonprofit, for example, has received local, state, and federal funds, are they required to follow the Open Meetings Act?
Oh, Laura, that's something we've worked on. Did you?
Open meetings.
The nonprofits, when they are you talking open meetings or open records? Open records?
Open records or open meetings?
Open.
Open records.
Oh, yeah. So it has to do with the amount, without having the law right in front of me, but this was recently negotiated a couple of sessions ago, but it has to do with the amount of money that comes from public funds, and also how that nonprofit is structured in its dealing with the government. That's a quick nutshell description, right, Laura? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ross Smith. I used to work at the Attorney General's office and dealt with the open records division quite a bit. Many small counties in Texas no longer have a newspaper in them. The places like Mineral Wells, their newspaper closed after 130 years, and they rely on a newspaper a county over that may have one person who occasionally monitors what's going on there. For people in counties like that who feel they are being stonewalled by the commissioner's court or the county attorney or a state or a local office, who do you suggest that they turn to for help? Because as you said, the exceptions are riddled like Swiss cheese, and they can get very arcane very quickly. Thank you.
I mean, you just described the exact problem across our country with media disappearing and them being, it was the only watchdog in so many small communities. What I have seen pop up in communities are citizens who are sick and tired of being ignored, who want information, and who use very easy public platforms to start yelling about it. which then gets the attention of the closest media. And it's been fairly effective in South Texas.
And to the extent that you need legal help, like you need help just sort of navigating the AG process, the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas has a hotline where they have volunteer attorneys that can help guide you.
I would also just add, it's FOIFT.org, Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. So FOIFT.org. They have sample Open Records Act letters on their website that you can sort of, it has the language that you can follow and you can plug in what specifically you're asking for. So.
And just for those scrambling to write that down, one of the things we are starting to do on our event recaps is include some resources at the bottom that are mentioned in the event, so we'll make sure to include that.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay, I fall into the rudimentary, unsophisticated requester. So as a non-journalist and a citizen, you hear something awful of what this state is doing. So a few weeks ago, I overheard someone talking about how state prisons don't require air conditioner. I thought to myself, I was like, that can't be true. Like that can't be true in this state. That is inhumane, that's cruel. What is kind of the rudimentary basic steps as a citizen? You hear something like that, then you go, okay, can I actually like request information about it? And then what's the action item as a citizen? Like what next?
So, I mean, a citizen or a journalist, you're going to treat it the same way. If I hear something, typically the first thing I do is I research it, right? Because I don't want to just jump to, I'm going to put a public information request in, and unless I've put the research in. So that's where I start. And then I try to figure out who's in charge of whatever it is that I want to know. And very often, I call them and I have a conversation with them before I ever put a request in, unless it's somebody I know that's going to just not give me the information. It begins with asking a lot of questions and doing research. I don't know if that's helpful to you.
Oh, I hear things too sometimes, and very often I just go to the Trib and put in some search terms, and I start pulling up some articles, and then I can link to other news organizations, and then I kind of figure out, wait a minute, some of that information's already out here.
And there's also advocacy groups. So maybe I know there's an inmates families association, some of those kind of groups. They probably have a lot of that information right at their fingertips.
Yeah, one other thing that I would say too is, it becomes sort of a skill to submit open records requests. For instance, you can't ask them to create a report for you, right? The document has to already exist. So you have to kind of think about like what documents might they have in order to get the information that you're looking for. So in that case, I would agree. Like, the Texas Tribune has written about this issue. I check out those articles, but also, think about like, well, if they don't have air conditioner and like there's been pressure, have they done any kind of studies or any research about like what it might cost to do, or have there been kind of reports on like heat, who's dying in Texas prisons because of access to heat? And then you can ask for like those specific records that can give you some more information about what's going on.
One of the questions that we received online, this person asks, should personal public records also have greater security? When most of our laws were passed, quote, available to the public, meant that the records were stored in a file cabinet at the courthouse. In the digital metadata age, there are 2 or 3 clicks away from being accessed from any place on Earth.
Well, from my perspective, we have an information security office that mandates protection, and they go through and determine what is sensitive, what is absolutely confidential, and they do regular reviews. So I feel very confident in our data. That may not be the case with some other entities, but I think we have all geared up because we are all concerned about security of personal information, financial information, phishing, hackers, all kinds of stuff.
Laura, do you want to talk briefly about dates of birth and the conversation around that?
Sure.
Me and
I know I
dates,
said
me,
briefly,
Laura,
and
and
that's
dates of birth.
Yeah.
If only Bill and a few other people were here. We had extras, yes.
So dates of birth is an issue that has been historically, when you submitted a TPIA request, you would be able to have the information disclosed, including the date of birth, for instance, that was listed on a front page offense report, right? You're looking to find out if this person who is driving your child to school in the school bus has been arrested for, some sort of child pornography act, right? So you look into that information, you get the information on the offense report, the date of birth is there, it's a common name, but because the date of birth is there, you're able to verify, yes, indeed, this is my school bus driver. I've got a big problem with this. That's how it used to be. About a decade ago, the courts decided that public employees' dates of birth were going to be no longer accessible through TPIA requests. That was going to be off limits, that would be covered by a personal privacy exemption, a common law privacy exemption. Then, a few years later, the Austin Court of Appeals extended that ruling to all dates of birth in public records, which the Texas Supreme Court decided not to take up that issue. And now we've got this situation where all dates of birth in all public records can be withheld, which leaves it almost impossible for us to be able to verify whether we are talking about the correct person. Y'all may have seen there's a lawsuit right now where the Allen Outlet Mall shooter was misidentified. He has a common name here in Texas, Mauricio Garcia. That common name was the name of the shooter and now this individual who has been misidentified. Date of birth access could have prevented this from happening. We have had now 4 times during the legislature, Chairman Todd Hunter has brought a bill to fix this problem because, let's be real, everybody has your date of birth on your Facebook page. Everybody has your date of birth on your LinkedIn page. It is out there. It is ubiquitous. We aren't talking about Social Security. We're not talking about TDL numbers. We're talking about one verifier to be able to ensure that you have accuracy in the information you're obtaining and the information you're reporting. And the bill has made it out of the House. The bill has made it out of the Senate. It has never made it out of both chambers in both sessions. So we are still trying to fix this problem. And until we do, we're going to have continuing problems with misidentification. And you're not going to be able to determine if the person who is driving your kids to school is a pedophile or not.
So we have just a few minutes left in our program here, but I would like to have these 3 gentlemen be able to ask their questions. Answers may be relatively brief, but I know that for those in person, I'm sure our speakers will stand by to be able to go into more detail with folks.
Hi, I'm Abhinav. Can you please tell me the difference between Freedom of Information Act in Texas versus the federal government? And thank you.
Would you like, well, why don't you
Well,
attorneys take that one?
okay, they are very similar, but they have a different process. And so if you're going to a federal agency, you're using the Federal Act. If you're going to a state entity, you're using the State Act. But they were really pretty well designed to protect a lot of the same information. That's just a sort of a layman's.
And different deadlines.
I'm a lawyer, but yeah, different
kick
deadlines,
in.
right.
We have
And
tighter deadlines.
we do. We have tighter deadlines. Some of the similar information is protected. The process by which you enforce it is a little different. But basically, it's a matter of which entity are you going to for the information as to which you're going to use.
Hasib Abdullah, resident here in Austin. The question I have, we're told AG is a very neutral arbiter. What percentage or even number of millions of freedom of information requests that go to the AG or even violations of the Open Meetings Act actually get litigated all the way up? And for one quick example is many agencies can just say something along the lines of, this is a sample of the documents, but they don't ask for the other, voluminous documents. So it's kind of goes to the goodwill of the agencies. seems AG just focuses on the goodwill and the trust of the agencies. Thank you.
The AG actually, if you have voluminous documents, encourages samples so they can get it out quickly because they do not want to look through 200,000 pages. So, but they're very clear, this had better be a representative sample. If you have misrepresented to us, this ruling is not valid.
I'm Representative Bruce Hargrave with the Texas Silver-Haired Legislature, and you mentioned the hacker situation a while ago, and this is addressed to the Deputy Counsel. But are there an exception in the Public Information Act regarding vetting some way whether or not a person is a hacker or some kind of a scammer or some other kind of thing? I know this is really an issue among a lot of people, everyday ordinary people, and especially seniors and things. And but with regard to our legislature and so forth, I'm just curious if there is any kind of exception relating to disclosing information just to people that may in fact have sinister reasons other than legitimate reasons, I guess is the question.
The act doesn't focus on the motives of the person. We take at face value that they want information. What it focuses on is the information itself. So there are exceptions for information that, if released, would compromise your security. There are exceptions for what's considered to be protected information. If someone comes in and they say, I am Jim Jones, and I want my entire personnel file that includes my social security number, driver's license, I'm going to be very sure you are Jim Jones. I'm not going to just give it out to anyone. I will give out redacted versions of your application and your evaluation if that's what you're asking for, but those would be redacted as to your information that would be protected. And certainly if someone comes in and says, I would like schematics to your system, that's not going to happen. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the excellent questions. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks for you being here.